Welcome, Coffee with Convery listeners. In today's episode, we are joined by the remarkable individual Chris Hooten, who is on a mission to reshape the narrative surrounding neurodiversity and foster inclusivity in teams, organizations, and communities. As a nationally recognized speaker, writer, advocate, and coach, Chris aims to help organizations welcome, promote, and address challenges faced by the neurodivergent communities, individuals, and especially those from people from the global majority, women and LGBTQ plus communities. With a focus on intersectional neurodiversity, Chris provides comprehensive cultural assessments, engaging keynotes and workshops, accessible forward coaching, and customized solution to bridge gaps and promote inclusivity. It's incredible to have Chris on the Coffee with Convery podcast, and I'm really excited to welcome you to the podcast. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for having me.
So excited to get going and to share your story with the listeners, but maybe I can start with a few rapid fire questions if that's okay with you.
Go ahead.
All right. So what are your pronouns?
My pronouns are they, them. I am non-binary.
Thank you. Awesome. And superpower? Do you have a superpower?
I think if I had to have a superpower, it would probably be the ability to see connections and patterns between things that appear to be unlike each other.
Awesome. Awesome superpower to have. We need people like you. We need more Chris's. Do you have a favorite smell?
Oh, that's an easy one. Lavender.
Oh, I love lavender.
I know. Yeah.
So soothing.
Can't go wrong with lavender.
Can't go wrong with lavender. If you had to think about best compliment you've ever received, what would that be?
The best compliment that I ever received was actually a review from a parent from a place that I used to work at. And it was after I had advocated for a gender, name, and pronoun change protocol for the institution, because this student had come back from winter break and they had been misgendered and misnamed a couple of times by teachers, and this parent trusted me enough to come talk to me about it and that I would take care of it, and I did. I advocated for an institution-wide response. I gave a presentation, and the parent was just so appreciative, and it was very moving to receive such a nice, lovely compliment about the impact that it had on not only the child but also their family.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you for doing what you do. That's an incredible story. We all have guilty pleasures, go-to snacks. What's yours?
Oh, peanut butter pretzels. Bar none.
Oh, peanut butter pretzel.
Don't let me have them. Don't let me, like, every time I go someplace. It's funny, whenever I travel to abroad, and I travel abroad a lot, I'm always like, oh, where are the peanut butter pretzels? And my spouse is always like, you are ditzy. Are you basic? Because I always expect to see them, and I'm like, oh, they don't have it here. And he's always like, babe. And I'm like, okay, all right. You're right. I'm tripping.
But that is a cool go-to. I think if I go through the past 3 years of this podcast, you're the first peanut butter pretzel.
It's
absolutely
iconic. It's
you
sweet.
are.
It's salty.
Yeah.
The consistency has to be just right. Sometimes it's too hard. Sometimes it's too flaky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a good one. It's a good one. Now you got me thinking about it. Favorite subject in school?
Oh, history.
History. Interesting.
History or English?
History, English.
English.
That's interesting.
Combination.
Okay.
Yeah.
We all started somewhere. With our first job, our first kind of working kind of experience. What was your very first job?
Is this out of graduation?
It can be anything. I mean, some people have talked about babysitting. I don't know, whatever you comes to mind for you as like your first, getting paid and doing your own thing. And
yeah. The first time that I got paid for my labor was actually when I was a lifeguard. So I grew up in Indianapolis in Indiana in the Midwest. People know where that is.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a very racist town. So for those who benefit from a cited description, I am a dark-skinned person wearing dark-rimmed glasses, got a wide nose, wide lips. Usually my fingers are painted, but they're not today because, fingernail polish isn't here today. And I've got a shaved head. I grew up in a very racist town and a very classist town. And I grew up very low income and Black. And one of my health teachers in high school uh, showed some doubt that I could become a lifeguard. So it was about that time of year, maybe it was spring. And she was talking to other students about becoming a lifeguard. And I said, "Oh, I'd like to sign up." And she looked at me and, I was like, "Okay, well, it may not be, for you."
Hmm.
And I remember that to this day. And I decided to go and try out anyway. And when I tell you I was struggling, I did struggle, right? But I eventually did it, and I
Mm-hmm.
eventually overcame the issue. And uh, I was a lifeguard. Indy
Wow.
Parks. I was a lifeguard. I made a lot of money. So it was, it was one of the first lessons that I learned about. Even though people will try to limit your expectations about yourself based on how they perceive you, you don't have to accept what's given to you.
Mhm. Wow. What a great lesson for the listeners as well. And thanks for sharing that. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, lifeguard. Wow. Um, and if you had to pick one word to describe yourself, what word would you pick?
Fluid.
Fluid. I love it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I love the rapid fire. I want to get right into it with you. So, your
Ah,
journey is like truly inspiring. I mean, I have been
thank you.
following you now. I'm a fanboy on LinkedIn, watching all the stuff you're doing and the inspiration you're showing to people. And
I'm getting
um,
in trouble. I'm getting in trouble on LinkedIn. Don't let me.
no, you're not. No, you're not. I love disruptors. But can you share a little bit more about like overall the specific challenges you faced growing up, and how those experiences have overall shaped your mission to promote things like neurodiversity and inclusivity today? Maybe go back to the beginning a
Yeah.
little bit, like you did with the lifeguarding.
Yeah. So I mean, I will talk about who I am, and in my tradition, you can't really talk about who you are without describing where you came from and what your lineage is. And
Yep.
so I like to tell a story that if you've heard me before, you might have heard this before, and that's perfectly fine. I always love giving this tale. But my grandfather was born on the same land in Clinton, Mississippi, that his grandfather was born in as an enslaved person.
Wow.
Right. And so he was a sharecropper picking cotton as a child in Clinton, Mississippi until the mid 1950s. His mother had gone up to the north in the first wave of the Great Migration in America. And he was left behind, like so many other people were. People talk about the Great Migration, but they don't really illuminate that because you were poor and Black, you couldn't bring everybody. And so there were these tales of children that were left behind.
Hmm.
So my grandfather, every single year, the Mr. Robert was his name, the sharecropping owner of the land would tell him, "Sorry, Willie," that was his name. "Better luck next year." And so we now know that sharecropping was a trap and an exploitative system to keep people on the land and to, lower their labor.
Hmm.
But my grandfather, maybe one year he was just too tired and he was just too angry. But he was the only young man because his cousins were all girls and his grandparents were too old. So it was just him picking the cotton. One summer he decided he was going to take it upon himself to pick all of the cotton, all 50 acres of it, and free his family from being sharecroppers. So he did every single day in the hot Mississippi heat, backbreaking work. He picked the cotton. At the end of the summer, right before it was time to wrap up, he accumulated all of it and talked to Miss Robert and said, "Hey, Miss Robert, I've done it. I've gotten all of the cotton. I've done the calculations. It's more than enough. We should be able to pay off the sharecropping." Miss Robert looked at him and said, "I did the calculations. I'm sorry, Willie. You didn't get it this year. Better luck next year." Maybe it was because he was tired. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe he didn't know because he was so young. But with tears in his eyes, my grandfather, Willie, at 15 years old, said, "You're a liar, Mr. Robert." And it still makes me shiver the bravery that
Hmm.
that took for a 15-year-old Black boy who knew nothing but Jim Crow, apartheid America, to tell a white man this could have cost him his life. And maybe it shamed Mr. Robert because a week later he said, "Oh, I redid the calculations, and lo and behold, you were right, Willie. Not only did you pay off the debt, and your family is no longer sharecroppers. Here's some extra money to go up north." And that's what my grandfather did because at that point he had to escape because people were telling him, if you don't go, you will be, we know what the word is, right? You
Mm-hmm.
will be hunted down.
Mm-hmm.
And so I talk about that because it's
Wow.
a way for me to illustrate to people that I come from a long line of people who spoke truth to power, who resisted their oppression, who saw possibilities when people said that there were none, right? And so right now, today, that's what I do. I talk about intersectional neurodiversity because I find that neurodiversity, as it is currently framed and discussed and mentioned and coached around, primarily focuses on or centers very limited number of identities. And so, I when I discovered my neurodivergent factors, I have ADHD, I also have dyscalculia, which is a little bit like, but not completely mapped onto like dyslexia. So
Mm-hmm.
things like distances, numbers, but also sequential thinking. So like I didn't know how to dance. So like I still get to this day can't do the electric slide. Like I can't do it. My brain just doesn't work that way. And my life transformed when I realized that I had these neurodivergent factors because it made everything else make sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that's what I do every day is I think about different frameworks. I help people talk about discussions. I recently developed a 4D model of neuro-inclusive communication, which talks about being direct, deliberate, descriptive, and diverse in how we communicate, and how that doesn't encourage people who are neurodivergent to become neurotypical, and it doesn't encourage neurotypical people to become neurodivergent as if it's possible. What it does is it provides a very clear foundation to look at our communication standards and say, oh, this isn't very direct. This isn't very descriptive. Can we make it more descriptive? Can we
Interesting.
make it more deliberate? And I've seen such great success with my clients because it's something that's affirmative. It's something that's positive. Right now, equity work is just focused on the negatives. I don't want to have microaggressions. I don't want to have biases. Like you go to a training and it's like, well, I'm so glad now that I don't have any I don't have any biases. I'm so glad that I'm no longer implicitly biased. And that's not how this works, right?
No.
But there's actually a lot of neuroscience around these things called nudges, where you shape the environment to, even without people knowing it, you positively or you sort of increase the chances that they're going to do something that's more affirming, more inclusive, more collaborative, more anti-racist, just by how you shape things and how you form the conditions. And so that for me, I'm just super excited about that.
That is incredible. And what insights you have from your lived experiences and your ability to share that with others so that they too can understand it better. I mean, just listening to you go through the explanation of some of that, and I do want to go back a little bit, even to your grandfather, even when you're saying
Mm,
1950, I mean, I'm going to age myself a bit, but that's not that long ago,
no,
right? And people
nope,
don't realize
nope.
today some of that this really was happening, not too long ago.
Yeah.
And what you've come from, and what that lived experience was for your grandfather. I think about it like incredible resilience and a lot of words that come to mind, obviously. But thank you for taking what you know and
Mm,
have to share that with people, because I think this is a topic that needs way more attention than it's receiving right now. And I'm glad that you're here to help drive some of that. Can I ask you just like from a neurodivergent perspective for maybe listeners who don't understand exactly what that is,
yeah.
or would like to know more about it? Um, I don't want to say just a definition, but like first, like when did you discover your neurodivergence, and then what
Mm.
would be the best definition for people to understand what someone experiences or how that works, if they're, of course they can Google, but if they're not aware of this.
These are all great questions, and so I'll start with the first.
Sure.
It's interesting. I discovered my neurodivergence. This is why I talk about intersectional neurodivergence and how it's so important, and visibility, and this, and how we talk about it, how we frame it, and what and who's saying it. So I was, I'll be frank and clear that I was struggling in a new job that I had taken. It was an inaugural DEI position And the institution that hired me didn't really know what DEI was. And, they kind of hired me to sort of put on sort of feel good, fun celebrations and
Mm-hmm.
not actually doing the work that is equity work. And so they were trying to pigeonhole and sort of distract, and that was causing some issues. And so one day I woke up early and I think I was experiencing some insomnia. And I just happened to come across a YouTube video of a Black woman that I followed who was articulate and interesting and engaging, and who I had really related to. And she was talking about her journey discovering her neurodivergence and in particular ADHD. And as she was talking about it and what it was like to grow up in a Black family and the respectability politics and navigating, not wanting to stand out because we come from a collectivist culture, but also, being expected to sort of do things in neurotypical ways, and how, that really caused some issues. And I related and connected, and it really got me thinking about neurodiversity in a different way and how limiting our understanding of it is. Excuse me, I'm going to cough for a second.
No problem.
And that for me is really exciting. So when I say I discovered my neurodivergence, I was around 29 years old. And
Okay.
I finally got and this was not easy, I finally got a quote unquote diagnosis from a medical provider. And the reason why I mentioned discover your neurodivergence is in that I was diagnosed, because I think that there's a tendency, especially in the West, of prioritizing or legitimizing the medical diagnosis of a doctor or a medical practitioner over a person's lived experience
Mm-hmm.
and their own interpretation of what the lived experience is, right? So I think people really want earthy things. They really want concrete, black and white, like delineated, you are this because you're not that, like sort into this kind of way thinking, right? We call this heuristics in the social sciences, right? People want shortcuts, right? But the beauty of neurodiversity is that it complicates and it's messy and it evades clear definition, right? And if you're thinking about what it means for me, I know that things like linear thinking, right? A plus B equals C. Like if when you're writing a story, usually you were probably taught in the West of you start with the introductory paragraph and you start with the claim and there's some evidence and there's some sub evidence and then you really go through it and it's very formulaic.
Very.
And that never made sense for me, right? This idea of like we're going to be sequential and very linear, that never made sense. I would start from F to L to Z to Q. It would be more like a cloud. It would be more like a cloud of ideas and concepts. And I could see there's a meme of that person who's like going insane, right? Like connecting all of these red yarn dots and he's like pointing at it and looks like he has a conspiracy theory in his mind. But for a lot of people, that is much more akin to the way that they organize their mind and their concepts and how they communicate. And that was really, really difficult for me. There's a lot of shame that I had to unlearn in trying to do what people call masking, which is to mirror the ways in which neurotypical people communicate, exist, and think and express themselves. And so part of what I do is I really try to get people to think not necessarily just of neurodiversity as the mind, because that is very abstract. I think of it as more of neurodiversity is a interconnected relationship between the body, the mind, and the heart. So when somebody is neurodivergent like myself, part of it is like I might move a little bit differently. I might tap things. I might be, if you probably heard this fan, I'm waving the fan. This is what we call self-stimulating behavior or stimming behavior, right? So it's to really regulate nervous energy. It's to help us sort of focus our attention, right? So there are all these tactics that people do who are neuroatypical, who are neurodivergent, and they use those terms interchangeably, even though, so there's some debate about whether or not they are interchangeable. But everybody is neurodiverse. And if I had one thing that I want people to think about is we call people neurodiverse and we should not do that.
Hmm.
In the same way that we shouldn't call somebody a diverse candidate. Everybody is a diverse candidate, right? There is no such thing as a diverse candidate. In the same way, there's no such thing as a neurodiverse candidate. Like there is neurodiversity within this workplace because everybody's mind works differently. You can get 10 people who all have ADHD
Hmm.
in the same room, and there's still going to be neurodiversity in that room, right? Because everybody exists on a spectrum. And so what my work is much more focusing on how do we look at and examine the ways in which neurodiversity intersects with racial identity and gender identity and disability and even sexual orientation in some cases,
Mm-hmm.
because it impacts all of these things. So we're used to looking at it like, well, this is you need an accommodation because of this, but not an accommodation because of that. And my focusing on is on, can we move away from just looking at it as these single issue things and more towards how do we shape this entire culture, the conditions in this space, so that everyone gets their core needs met, so they're able to thrive. Not doing the bare minimum to try to avoid a lawsuit, but how do you, in an ethic of appreciation and really valuing a person's dignity, offer things that make them feel safe? And that's going to look different
Mm-hmm.
for different people.
Yeah, totally. And as we're talking or listening to you talk about this, my mind can't stop running with the fact that, when we look at equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace and people who talk about this or hold a title as such as being an equity, diversity, and inclusion officer or whatever the title might be of the flavor of the day, rarely, at least in the worlds that I've been traveling in the last few years, do I even hear mention of neurodiversity.
Yep.
And maybe I'm naive, or maybe I've been running in circles that aren't educated enough on this, or I'm not sure why, but why do you think this? So you said yeah, so why do you think that this isn't talked about as much as some of the, I want to say more visible or more talked about
Yeah.
items? I don't, it's, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm
Well,
glad we're talking about it
you
tonight, but I just see it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that you're right. I think your instinct is correct in the sense that there are very few instances of the institution or the organization or the team or the wherever it is, the school of the company, discussing neurodiversity week or discussing neurodivergence awareness week or discussing autism awareness week, right? Or autism acceptance week. I think that that's a very contentious topic amongst the people in the autism community, right? This idea of like acceptance versus awareness. People are aware, but they need to be accepting, right? I think that the thing that you hit on that's really important is visibility.
Mm,
We know from research that just around 20% of the people who are neuroatypical or neurodivergent will disclose as such within their workplace, right? So people say, oh, I don't have anybody. Say, well, yes, you do, right? Based on research, of course you do. Whoever you think you have, you need to usually multiply it by 5 at least, right? And so people, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. Stigma, fear that they're going to be discriminated against, and they're not wrong on the whole. Right? People do unfortunately still hold very stringent and archaic and I would say unfortunate beliefs around the capacities for people who are neurodivergent to engage and contribute and to understand and to go above and beyond, right? And I think that we still exist in a workplace and in a culture where people they're sort of primed to believe that an accommodation, let's say, noise canceling headphones in a very open office, it's noisy, people are sort of chatting and running around. If you're somebody on the autism spectrum, that's going to be very difficult historically, we've seen, for them to be at their optimum, right? And if you have a workplace boss who says, well, everybody's got to be able to like listen to me, I've got to be able to make a speech or sort of say something, and I want your attention, and go 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 go, and we hear this phrase fast-paced environment. uh, Fast-paced environment is just a way of saying organized chaos, right?
yep.
And I want people to be clear about that. Like, if you are not even just people who are neurodivergent, if you are anybody, it's very difficult for you to thrive in that. And so I move away from saying accommodations and more into things like people benefit from.
Yes.
Right? It's because it's much less stigmatized. Like, and also it's not that, I want to take away language around people who have fought really hard to get what we've gotten, with the ADA and the American Disabilities Act and everything. We've done a lot of great work, and there's still a lot of stigma. So I feel like we have to switch up our approach and be more direct. People benefit from these things, which means you as an employer are going to benefit from this, right? And so when you say like there's not a lot of mention of it, it's the very nature of it, right? Like if somebody gives you something that benefits you, it's usually in this indirect, like very behind the scenes. We're going to give you this thing. Sometimes you have to even negotiate for these things. It's a very contentious process. And then, from my personal experience, they make you feel as though they're, giving you the second handing of God, right? Like they are going above and beyond for giving you this, and that you better make sure that you continue working at your level or higher, right? Like that's sort of the implicit expectation is that, well, we gave you this thing, and so you're going to work harder, right? And if you're a person of color or a woman or a femme or a queer or a trans person, there are other things going on, right? And so if they say, well, we're going to give you this one thing, and now you have to be better at everything else, that's not a recipe for success.
No.
And so that's partly why it's like it's individualistic. And I talk about this all the time in my speeches around, we have this habit of doing what I call individualizing the institutional. So when somebody names a problem, says, hey, we don't have gender neutral bathrooms, just for another example.
Yeah.
Somebody will say, well, you want gender neutral bathrooms? It's like, no, that's not what I said. I said, we don't have gender neutral bathrooms. But they make it sound like you're advocating or you're pushing for something. And then they'll say, well, you need to be the one to advocate for it, which is their way of saying you need to take on this unpaid labor. Right?
Absolutely.
There are all these barriers and reasons why people aren't speaking up and why they're not advocating.
Yes, it's like the job descriptions that say you will wear many hats. What does that mean?
Yes.
It's similar in that way. Can I ask you, so with your consultative nature and the ability that you can talk through this with us and for the audience is understanding as well, what working with these diverse organizations and working with different organizations, what do you advise to some of these folks where, like the example you just gave was a typical one that I've seen, but like what do you give, what advice do you have to organizations around how to maybe think differently, or let's not say just think, let's act differently about welcoming and creating opportunities, especially for people with intersectional neurodiversity?
The first thing that I mention to people is you should be on this bus already because the bus is already gone. So oh, well, we're thinking about, well, you should have thought about this 10 years ago. There's an old Japanese saying that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. Right? The US and the US, Canada, North America, everywhere, we're seeing younger generations are becoming more neurodivergent, more racially diverse and ethnically diverse and multicultural, and more gender diverse and gender flexible and gender expressive.
That's right.
So this idea of like, well, we can just keep on keeping on. It's like, well, you're going to keep on keeping on until it becomes a problem. And then it's going to be more costly to build the trust, to, deal with the issues that may come with that, to worry about all of those things, right? And you're on the defense. Why not take this opportunity while we have it? We know what the projections are going to be. Why not take the opportunity to affirmatively build the skills that are going to result in a more positive workplace culture, better communication, higher innovation. Evidence shows 20% increase in innovation just in providing reasonable accommodations, reasonable things that help benefit people who are neurodivergent, because they benefit everyone, right?
That's right.
And so I sort of, the first thing I do is I sort
Very
of
interesting.
take a step back. I think about what's the reason that you're doing this. And so one framework that I use, I call it the strategy slide. It's people, because I'm a strategist, and people, I know somebody are thinking, I hear them, they sound like they're all over the place. They do strategy. Yes, neurodivergent people can do strategies. We can think logically. We just think differently. But one way that I talk about thinking and strategizing is the spirit, the space, and the specifics. So often people will come to me and say, hey, we have this issue. Give us the answer. We want to do it. We want a quick and dirty, slap it on, just keep going, right? Kind of modality. And I say, hold up, right? I can tell that you're unsettled. I can tell that you're worried or you're concerned or you've got other things going on. First thing we gotta do is take a step back, settle our bodies and our minds so that we can see these things clearly. And then the second thing is think about the space. The space talks about the context, the laws, the regulations, the demographics, right? The expectations, the communication models, all of these things. That's really the things that shape behavior. That's the space, right? Space will then limit or sort of shape the spirit. What's possible? Why are you actually doing this? What is your vision? What is your aim? What is your hope? Right? And then once you have an understanding of what the space is and how that impacts the spirit, you're left with a few specific strategies that, when implemented in the right way, in the right timing, will get us to the most high likelihood of getting to our goal, our aim. Right?
Okay.
So space, spirit, strategy, right? And so I tell people all the time, and they're like, "Oh, wow, that's amazing." And it's like, "Well, yeah, like you have to have in the African American community where I come from. We say come correct, right? You have to do the right thing. I mean, how many times have you been with somebody or interacted with somebody and they quote unquote did the right thing, but it didn't feel affirming. It didn't feel like they cared. It didn't feel as though they understood
Check
the
the
impact that they
box.
had. Right. They're just sort of going through the motions, right? Like we're just doing this so we don't get sued. And people know
Right.
that, right?
Right.
And so if we want to engage people, we want to have them really give their all, we've got to teach companies and organizations and leaders to give their all.
100%. And it's so key on the engagement factor of that and how different um, people respond to different types of, yeah, 100% agree with you. I'm thinking the organization's one side, and then, also there may be a listener of the podcast today that's recently discovered that they may be neurodivergent. And, you know, could you talk from that side, like any advice or thoughts you'd have to an individual who may be um, realizing this or going through and trying to figure out how to navigate this?
That's a heavy one.
I know it
Mostly
is.
because, like there's just so much there.
Yeah.
It's almost as though people follow the 5 stages of grief.
Okay. Yeah.
I know that for me, it was similar to that because there's a lot of anger, I think, initially for many people around, I'm angry. I can't believe I've missed out on things could have been so different if I feel like I wasn't offered the right accommodations or the right supports. People didn't understand. I wasn't able to give my best. I missed out on. That is completely natural. That's completely normal. And I want to encourage people. There's a tendency to sort of be optimistically toxic around like, oh no, it's fine. And but you got this, you made it through it and all that. And it's like, well, no, it's important for us to really acknowledge how we feel about these things and
Hmm.
really process it. Because if there's pain there, there's usually a wound that has not been tended to.
Mm.
And so what I talk about is, and what's helpful for me is I talk about the 4 R's of restoration: rest, receiving support, reading, and reflecting. So I have benefited from being able to heal and take time to reflect every day. That's important for me. 2024 for me is I don't do resolution. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I do more themes. So for me, the year of 2024 is the year of slow. I'm slowing down. I'm being intentional. I'm
Mm.
reflecting.
It's
Right?
wonderful. Yeah.
And so reading, resting, receiving, and offering support. Once you get to that point, you don't start with offering. You start with receiving and reflecting. These things really helped me. So I did a lot of reading. Right, first do a lot of reading. If you find you're neurodivergent, do a lot of reading. It's also really not uncommon for people who are in their late 20s to discover their neurodivergence. because that's usually the point where things get real, right? Like usually the point where in your career where you're like, hey, here's all these responsibilities. Here's being a manager, and the things that we grew up with and learned that were helpful strategies and sort of learned behaviors, the learn masking, the suppressing of things, the sort of turning the other cheek, all those things. I can speak. I'm not going to speak from a sort of clinical background because I'm not a
Yeah.
clinician.
Yeah.
For me, they broke down when I was 29. I found myself just not being able to do my work
Can I ask you a
well.
question on that? Sorry to interrupt. Is that
Yeah.
because you were, I think to use your words, if I got it correct, were you masking up until that point? Like, because why is this
Oh
not
yeah.
discovered younger? I
Oh
don't,
yeah. I mean, well, partly because I'll be frank about this. In the African American tradition that I grew up in,
yeah,
we don't think of neurodivergence as something that's for us. Like we're like, oh, that's a white people thing.
interesting.
Like, oh, that child don't need that. He's just running around. He just needs to get his butt whooped, right? There's this sort of language around that, right? Like they're touched by just a little touched, which means touched by the Lord. It's like no, that child has autism. That child has Down syndrome. It's okay to say that,
Right.
right? But I think that for a lot of reasons, people in the African American tradition where I grew
Okay.
up, especially the Deep South, internalize these sort of ways of seeing things for not as bad as they were. Because frankly, if you were to go to a slave master or a sharecropper and say, "My child is this," or "We need this," you've caused a problem for that person, and they're just as likely to kick you off or to sell you down the river or do some other horrible thing
Mm-hmm.
than they were to meet your need. And
Gotcha.
when you're like your whole existence is based off of being a worker and giving people profit, if you're not doing that, then you are made vulnerable to horrible, horrible things. So I think that it's a holdover from not being able to actually have our needs met, right? It sort of skews things. But
Gotcha.
to your point, I was taught be twice as good to get half as much growing up. So I was taught like suffering is you're gonna suffer. It's gonna So I thought it was normal. Like I don't know if we can talk about medication, but when I first took my medication, I vividly remember thinking to myself, "Oh my God, this is how it feels to feel safe."
Hmm.
I have never felt safe in my entire life. I just remember just feeling so calm and organized and capable. And it was beautiful and amazing, but it was also really tragic and sad because I had to process the anger and the frustration that came with having to struggle. Because I went to grad school.
Right.
I got
Right.
my master's degree right before I took calculus and stats and all that. And I had dyscalculia, right? Like I had all the best grades except for math, right? And
Mhm.
I was like, oh, why aren't I good at this? And I was like, oh, well, you have dyscalculia. You quite literally cannot do math the way that it is traditionally taught, right?
Yeah. Can I ask you on that front, like, first of all, congratulations, like what you've achieved with your education and you were the first person from your family to graduate from college. So that's a massive achievement. But with that, how has that educational journey also influenced your approach to advocating for educational inclusivity and support for people like you and others? Like, because uh, I can't imagine the classroom is tailored to help support that or yeah, I guess
No, no, no. Right. Like I talk about how I survived the US education
yeah,
system, right?
survived it. Yeah, I guess that's a
Right.
good
I
point.
survived it because it wasn't designed for me to thrive. And um it even from a young age, I knew if I were to get out of my surroundings, I would need to get I would need to go to college. That was not a suggestion. I needed to go to college. I needed to get an education if I had any shot at not living in poverty for the rest of my life. And so that's what I did, right? So I became sort of associated with it. And so but then my worth became attached to it. So whenever I didn't do well, my self-esteem, my sense of dignity, my sense of self-worth really took a hit. And so learning about neurodiversity and neurodivergence and how it impacts things like education and being expected to sit down, especially for people who are, again, I'm non-binary, but people who are socialized as male, right? Like I'm socialized as male presenting.
Mm-hmm.
Being able, having the expectation you're going to sit down, listen to somebody talk to you. You're not going to move things. You're not going to manipulate things. You're not going to be out in nature. You're not going to investigate for 8 hours. And if you talk or if you move or if you fidget, you're especially for Black boys. There's a lot of research about this, about how, at a table of children,
Mm-hmm.
preschoolers, when teachers look at a table of preschoolers, if there's a Black boy and a Black girl and a white boy and a white girl, they did eye tracking, and teachers were asked, tell us which problematic behaviors occurred and who did it. And all teachers, Black, white, Latino, Asian, all of them, over reported on the Black boy. And the eye tracking software demonstrated a 32% focusing on the Black boy, right? And
Wow.
the children did the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So people are primed to expect and to see misbehavior. And so a lot of the things that I did that were neurodivergent characteristics or traits, stemming or being excitable or hyper focusing, were read as potentially criminal, bad things. So I am really passionate. I'm not. I'm not going to be frank here, but I don't work with schools because, frankly, they don't pay that much, and they always want too much, and schools are toxic. We're not going to get into all of that, right? But would love to, when they
That's
give me access. I would
another
love.
that's another podcast we can talk about.
Yes, it
It's
is.
it's huge to unpack. You're right. It is. I get
But
it.
they have such a need. They have
100%.
such a need, and they still. It's just very sad how
It is
little
very sad.
they put towards resources.
Yeah, it is. It is very sad. Um, wow,
Yeah.
what an incredible night talking to you about all this. I'm so inspired and educated even more by talking with you as our
Thank you,
listeners are
Brian.
as well. I thank you for this. I'm just thinking, we're starting to get towards the end here. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that I didn't ask you, or something that you wanted to maybe share with the listeners? As again, got a pretty
Mm.
dynamic group of 15, 35-year-old listening audience here, all kind
Yeah.
of going through these, pivotal moments in life that are difficult for most in
Mm.
any given day. But anything that you wanted to talk about that I didn't bring up? Just curious.
I think that what is speaking to me right now is we are in a moment of incredible seismic change, just in general. And I'll leave it at that, right?
Yeah.
And when people experience that, their sense of safety, their sense of what is up and down, what is right and wrong, what is stable, it gets shaken, and people can feel lost in that.
Hmm.
And I want to encourage people. Something that I learned myself is we want so badly to belong that sometimes we lose ourselves. And we can one day learn that you can belong to yourself if you are rooted in who you are and what you are and how you are. You learn to love that.
Hmm.
It is much easier to hold to your values and your convictions.
Such great thoughts and wisdom. Thank you so much. Wow. Like I said, I can't wait to see where you go from here. I'm so glad I got to meet
Thank
you,
you.
and I thank you immensely for being a part of and a very important part of this podcast.
Thank you,
I,
Brian.
I thank you so much, Chris. It was great to have you on.
This is great. Thank you so much. I
Well,
appreciate you.
no, I again appreciate you. Well, for our audience, our listeners, if you like what you heard today, please share this podcast with your network on Spotify. Give us a rating. Follow us on Instagram, Coffee with Convery. This has been Coffee with Convery. And until next time, please stay well.